Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the weekly Independent Sage briefing. I'm delighted to be back here introducing the session again and joining the whole team of Independent Sage who will be answering your questions later. Now, on Monday, people who are double vaccinated will no longer be required to self-isolate if they're pinged by the app. So that's the latest change to measures introduced by the government over the pandemic. And perhaps it could signify the beginning of a return to normality. But is it wise and is it safe? And is this really the beginning of the end? What is the new normal going to look like? So we'll be discussing those questions and others. And as always, Independent Sage is here to answer your questions too. So we'll have questions from the press and the public. We'll also have a summary of the latest data from Professor Christina Pargle as well. But first of all, Professor Deenan Pillay is going to make a short statement. Over to you, Deenan.
Thanks, Alice. I just wanted to say a few words and embarrass our current chair, Sir David King, who's joining us here. Just to remind everyone, it's more than a year ago that Sir David got us all together and had the foresight to establish Independent Sage. And he's been an immense support for us, complete commitment to transparency of scientific information, engagement with the public, and of course, holding those in power to account for their actions for the pandemic response. And he's been a supporter of us all the way through. Now, Sir David, who was 82 yesterday, happy birthday, David. Dave has at the same time, based on the success of Independent Sage, established the Climate Crisis Advisory Group, a huge task ahead, and of course a much bigger task than dealing with a pandemic virus. It really is the crisis facing us all, and Dave has thrown himself into that, very successful, and I encourage everyone to follow that group on the web, on Twitter, and sign into the press conferences. But Dave has had to commit himself to that, and therefore has announced that he wants to slightly remove himself from this group. He will never be gone, and therefore we acknowledge his new title as founding chair of Independent Sage. We thank Dave on behalf not only of all of us in Independent Sage, but all the public who benefited from our advice and your advice. So thank you, Sir Dave.
Right.
Deenan, thank you for your very, very kind comments. I really wasn't looking for that, but thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Deenan and Sir David, and happy birthday, Dave, as well. And now Professor Gabriel Scally is going to say a few words as well.
Thank you, Alice. Independent Sage meetings are open to the public, and during these meetings over the last year and a bit, we've heard from hundreds of people and helped them with their queries. They've asked us some really searching queries, and we've learned lots from them. Last Friday, a 13-year-old boy wanted to ask a question about the safety of schools, and we were pleased to hear from him. Subsequently, he was threatened and abused on social media by adults, including well-known people with public profiles. We find this appalling. We have reported it both to Twitter and to the police, who as yet have not responded. But we did want to make this statement and make it clear how unacceptable this activity has been. Thank you very much, Alice.
Thank you very much for that, Gabriel. And now it's time for the latest facts and figures with Professor Christina Pargle. Christina, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Right. Okay, here we go. So today I am going to go through kind of the usual, as in vaccinations, cases, hospitalizations and deaths. And then I'm going to end with a little section just kind of giving a bit of perspective on some of the numbers, both kind of over time and internationally. So starting with vaccinations, not much has changed over the last few weeks, really. It's still kind of about 200,000 a day, dominated by second doses. and we're seeing, a trickle of new first doses, maybe 15 to 20,000 a day. And this is kind of playing itself out if we look at the overall percentage of the population who are vaccinated or not. So what we're seeing is that we are now, approaching somewhere between 60 and 70% of the population being fully vaccinated. But what we're doing is we're moving people from this blue group, the partially vaccinated group, into the orange group, more than we're affecting the kind of 25 to 30% of people who remain unvaccinated. So this kind of chart shows it a bit clearer. This is from Public Health England. This is age groups, and this is over time, the percentage of people who've taken up their first dose. And you can see for the older age groups, went up very, very rapidly and have been really high for a long time. And then as people get younger, there's just been less, less uptake, increasingly less uptake. So 45 to 49-year-olds are about 80%, about 75% for 40 to 44-year-olds, and so on. And it looks like for the kind of 18 to 30-year-olds, we're going to be at around 60 to 65% for first doses. So ideally, we do really want to increase that. Under 18s is really low. I'm hoping this will change a tiny bit over the coming weeks as we've now opened it up to 16 to 17-year-olds. So cases. This is new UK confirmed cases by reported date to 12th of August. And you can see this is the kind of July 19th peak and the rapid drop, but things have now started going up again, not as quickly as they were in July, but nonetheless, they are going up. You can see this more clearly if we just zoom in here. And if we look at it by nation, they are going up in every nation, and apart from Northern Ireland, pretty much kind of at the same rate. And that's mirrored in positivity rates. So this isn't really a function of testing. It's only Northern Ireland that is still seeing positivity rates drop. But having said that, they are really, really high in Northern Ireland. So it looks like Northern Ireland is getting better at getting people to get tested. But in Wales, England and Scotland, we are seeing positivity rates increase. And certainly, being at around 5 to 10% is quite high. And this is mirrored by the ONS infection survey that came out today. They're saying basically things are pretty flat right now in England and Wales, going up in Northern Ireland and going down in Scotland. And that kind of mirrors what we've seen in the data. Remember, ONS tends to be lagged by a little bit and is measuring something slightly different to new cases, but they are kind of broadly telling you the same thing. And this is kind of where things are. So we know that Northern Ireland is really high, and you can see here, it's got the highest rates in the UK. And then it's the Northeast and some of the Midlands, but we're now seeing quite high numbers in the southwest of England, which I can only assume is driven by domestic tourism over the summer. And if we look at English regions, you can see that the Northeast had this massive spike in July, and that's now come down, and they're still kind of coming down or plateauing, but all other regions are now seeing increases, like not very steep increases, but cases are going up. And we see exactly the same picture if you look at positivity rates. So this does look like a genuine increase and isn't about more testing. And this is just kind of wanting to give you kind of a bit of perspective on the numbers, just looking at the overall numbers of new confirmed cases in England by reported date to the 12th of August. So, in the first wave, in the first half of the second wave, so from September to the end of lockdown number 2 in November, there are about 1.4 million cases. And then we had 2.5 million cases from December to the end of April this year. And since the beginning of May, so kind of the Delta wave, if you like, we've had 1.6 million cases reported. But we haven't finished this wave yet. And, we're going into September in a few weeks. This is where we went into September last year. And this is where we're going into September now. So we've still got, I suspect, unfortunately, it looks like we will have several 100,000 more cases before we start seeing significant decreases. In terms of ages, this is a heat map in England of cases per 100,000 per week. It goes from young children up to people over 60, and you can see this is the latest week, and cases are now very concentrated in young adults from 15 to 30, which I imagine is a combination of lower vaccination rates, but also more socializing. But what you can also see, or will be clearer in the next slide, is that from these big peaks in July, cases in under 18s have been dropping, right? These numbers here are all lower than they were the week before, and they were all lower than the week before that, and so on. So basically, since school's been over, under 18s have seen cases dropping. All other age groups, since the end of July, have gone up. So you can see that a bit more clearly here. So this is just splitting out into under 20s, which is this black line. You can see they're continuing to drop or stabilize. And then adults between 20 and 60 and over 60s are going up. And it's mainly in the 20 to 60-year-olds that you're seeing cases increase. And what is a little worrying is that actually, if you look at it regionally, just for over 60s, you can see that all regions are seeing quite sharp increases in over 60s. And I think that's been hidden in the overall numbers simply because the Northeast has been dropping and they had the highest numbers. This is worrying because the over 60s are more vulnerable to getting really sick from COVID. This is the population that we're trying to protect from infection. And actually these rates of, 50 to 150 per 100,000 per week are quite high. So hospitalizations and deaths. The number of people in hospital by UK nation is it's a bit different. So in Northern Ireland, it's been going up. Presumably this is a consequence of the very quite sharp recent surge in Northern Ireland. It's been flat in England and coming down in Scotland and flat in Wales. So that's kind of slightly different pictures for each nation. Looking at admissions in England, we saw a drop that came kind of mirroring the drop in cases that we saw after 19th of July, but that has now stopped. And it looks like we're just starting to see an increase, but it's really too early to say whether that will last. But certainly the drop has stopped. And what's quite interesting is that the fall in hospitalizations hasn't been as big as the fall in cases. And I think that's partly because the fall in cases was driven mostly by under 18, so school-age kids, who are much less likely to need hospital. The fall in cases in adults has just been less. And we're now seeing especially increases in the over 60s. And so that was going to keep hospital admissions relatively high. Since the 1st of May, we've had 33,000 hospital admissions in England, and we're currently adding about 5,000 new admissions a week. And if hospital admissions keep going up, that's going to go up. I just kind of sometimes think that people haven't been paying too much attention to admissions because we're not at anywhere near the peak where we were at in January, but we are still seeing a significant burden of ill health every week from COVID. Looking at it across regions, you can see that it's kind of definitely flattened off. And it's kind of interesting that the Northeast is kind of just shown an uptake in the last few days, and the Southwest, where we've actually seen quite high case numbers, and the east of England, where the other regions at the moment are either flat or falling. This is just trying to understand a bit about the link between cases, confirmed cases, and hospital admissions. So the brown line, the average of cases over the last couple of months. And what we've done is you take hospital admissions and you push them back a week to kind of match when those people got a positive test. And there's a really good correlation, so that, when cases go up, hospital admissions go up a week later, and when cases come down, hospital admissions come down a week later. That's kind of how it works. And then, it's very simplistic. But then what you can do is you can say, okay, well, what percentage of cases, confirmed cases, end up in hospital a week later? And this is a plot of that percentage over time for 3 nations, so England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. Wales isn't included because it calculates admissions differently from the other nations. And what we've been seeing is that since January, that percentage has come down from, between 6 and 10% down to between 2 and 4%. Now, that is the impact of vaccination. It's weakening the link between a case and a hospitalization, which is a really good thing. But over the last few weeks, this percentage has started creeping up again. And what that's saying is that link that we've weakened is becoming less weak. So it's probably a combination of perhaps less testing, so that actually we're not picking up quite as many cases as we should be to kind of make that percentage higher. And the other reason I think is because actually over the last few weeks, what we've seen is cases dropping in younger children. And so more cases are now in older people and more likely to need hospital. But so what this means is that actually, even though cases overall have seemed quite flat, they've been increasing in adults who are more likely to need hospital. And this has implications for sickness and the NHS. And in fact, just yesterday, there was a story about there's an NHS Summer Crisis, London hospitals declaring a black alert and more operations cancelled in the north. And there's a high burden at the moment of people needing accident and emergency, people needing care that they missed out on during COVID, but also other viruses are coming back now that there's more mixing. So for instance, paediatric hospitals are quite full with children who have other respiratory viruses as well. On deaths, much lower than peak. That is a vaccination benefit. I think Public Health England recently estimated that we've saved, 86,000 lives with vaccination. I mean, that's pretty incredible. But we are going up, and we are now averaging at about 100 a day. So just some perspective. Firstly, it's still true that the most deprived communities are much more likely to have very high case rates. That's been true for the whole pandemic, and it's still true that that's where the burden of ill health is falling. And you can see that after the kind of July peak, everywhere fell, but deprived communities fell less far, and everywhere has now kind of started going up again. In terms of socializing, people are more slowly than I think many expected, but are starting to socialize more. And we can see now there is a lot more indoor socializing than there was pre the 19th of July. And just looking back to where we were a year ago. So this is plotting, the red line is cases this summer since 1st of July. And the blue line is cases last summer since the 1st of July. And you can see that this summer we've had far more cases than we had a year ago. We're now in England averaging about 25,000 cases a day. And a year ago, we were at 800 cases a day. And a lot of people have been saying, well, it doesn't really matter because we've broken the link between cases and hospitalizations. It's just not true that that it doesn't matter, and B, that we've broken that link. If we look at hospital admissions in England this summer, which is the red curve, compared to last summer, which is the blue curve, our hospital admissions are 10 times higher than they were a year ago. And that difference between the 25 times and 10 times, that's your vaccination difference. But it's not negligible, right? They haven't done everything. They can't do everything. So we're now seeing 10 times hospitalization rate that we had a year ago. And this is August should be the easiest month to keep cases down for COVID. And just kind of looking at hospital admissions a bit by different age groups. This is over the whole pandemic for over 65-year-olds. So this is 65 to 84-year-olds, and this is over 85-year-olds. And what you can see is that basically there's been a massive vaccine benefit for these age groups. They're nowhere near their previous peaks, which is a really, really good thing. But they are still quite a bit higher than they were a year ago, right? We still have more people needing hospital in these age groups than we did a year ago. For people who are kind of working age adults of 18 to 64-year-olds, they are also nowhere near the peaks. And that is also basically a benefit of the vaccine, particularly because in that 18 to 64-year-old age group, the older ranges have more vaccinated. But we are still a lot higher than we were a year ago. Much higher. This is kind of the bulk of our hospital admissions. And now if we look at children, this is hospital admissions for under 18, so 0 to 5 years and 6 to 17 years. Now, firstly, these are much, much lower numbers than for adults. So, on the order of 10 to 50 a day. But there's no vaccine benefit here for these children because they haven't been offered the vaccine. And so this summer, they've had the same level of admissions than we had in the January peak. And again, this peak isn't over and we're about to go back to school. So I just kind of want to show that from different age groups, we're having a different pandemic experience. For children, they're back in the peak without the protections that we have from vaccination. And just to kind of put some numbers on it, in the first wave, there were 1,300 admissions in children under 18. Between the 1st of September and the end of April this year, there were just over 4,000 admissions. And since the 1st of May, we've had over 2,000 admissions in under 18s. And again, as I said, it's not over yet. So there are still a significant number of children needing hospital with COVID. And this is just looking at vaccination. This is the percentage of the whole population who received one vaccine dose by country. We're in the red. And you can see that although we have high vaccination rates, we're not the best in the world. And basically most of Europe is now at around our level. Smaller countries like Iceland and Malta have very, very high rates of full vaccination. But other countries, Italy, Spain, and so on, France also have, somewhere between 50 and 60% fully vaccinated. We can also do this for children. This is just a percentage of under 18s who received one vaccine dose by country. Now, I could only find numbers for under 18s, but obviously out of that, only 12 to 17-year-olds are currently eligible for vaccination. So these are percentages of under 18s, but about half of that group aren't eligible for a vaccine. But what you can see is that England here is the outlier, that most countries, high-income countries, are offering the vaccine to 12 to 17-year-olds and are doing it and are going on and are going ahead with it. So, and there are more countries here that I haven't put on because I couldn't find their numbers. And I just kind of want to say that there's another way in which the UK is an outlier. So not only are we one of the very few high-income countries not to offer vaccination to 12 to 17-year-olds or 12 to 15-year-olds now, we're also a bit out of step with school guidance. So the European Centres for Disease Control, their guidance is in the context of Delta circulating and the context that children are the largest unvaccinated population group, there have to be appropriate in-school mitigation measures, and there has to be a high level of preparedness in the education system to minimise the likelihood of transmission among students and staff. That's their advice for coming into September. The CDC in the States released new guidance yesterday, saying that given new evidence on Delta, they now recommend universal indoor masking for all teachers, staff, students, and visitors to schools, regardless of vaccination status. It says children should return to full-time in-person learning in the fall with layered prevention strategies in place. The UK, the news headlines this week have been saying that schools are not hubs of infection and are safe to reopen after summer break. We've removed masks, we've removed bubbles, we've removed contact tracing, we've removed using contacts to isolate, we've removed social distancing. So we're basically a country where we're not vaccinating, we're not making schools safer, and we're also not protecting schools by having transmission low in the community. And I think we're pretty much the only high-income country that is doing none of those three things. So I personally think that this is quite a reckless approach. So, summary. Cases are going up again, mainly the over 18s. Hospitalizations are flat or increasing. We'll know better what that trend is next week. Vaccinations are continuing, but the rate of first doses is now quite slow, but hopefully we'll start seeing 16 and 17-year-olds taking it up over the next couple of weeks. We are out of step with our international peers when it comes to vaccinating children and mitigations in schools. And I guess finally, we're approaching autumn with cases 25 times higher. and hospitalizations 10 times higher than last year, and with an NHS that is severely under strain. And we're only one doubling away from July peak. And if cases start accelerating in September and go back to doubling every week or two, that's a couple of weeks. So we don't really have very much room to maneuver, to react if things start to get bad. I mean, that is one of the problems about coming into a period when we're going back to work, going back to school, and going indoors as autumn approaches. You know, we haven't left ourselves very much room to maneuver, and we have far fewer mitigations in place than I think the situation requires. And I will end there.
Thank you very much indeed, Christina, for those latest facts and figures, and particularly for that international perspective on schools, and realising that Britain is alone in what we're doing with schools and the planned return in September. So that's it for facts and figures, but I expect we'll hear some more as we go through the discussion. We're going to open up to questions from the press and the public now. And the first question is coming from Colin Lees. Colin, over to you. I can see that you're with us, Colin. Do you have a question for us? Oh, yes, he's here.
Yes, thank you very much. I would like to ask a question about so-called booster jabs. I had my second Pfizer jab on the 3rd of January, and like a lot of old people like me, I'm wondering what level of immunity we're likely to have by next January, and whether a shot in between now and then would be good, whether we benefit from that. And secondly, do you think there is an ethical choice between doing this and shipping more vaccines to other countries? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colin. Deanan, could I come to you first on that one, because it's quite a virological question, that, I think.
Thanks, Alison, and thanks, Colin. I'll certainly give a stab at responding. It's both virological, it's immunological, it's also regarding global equity. So there's a large number of issues that Colin has raised. Clearly, there is some concern of how long vaccine protection will last after 2 doses. And certainly many older people, such as yourself, have been vaccinated some months ago, and we know that antibodies do start to decline. But we do not yet know with any level of confidence, I think, the precise way in which boosters may be needed, because of course boosters can work in a number of ways. It could be a booster with the same vaccine that we had at the beginning, whether that's AstraZeneca or Pfizer. It could be with a different vaccine, and there's some evidence that using mixed vaccines may actually broaden the immune response. And of course, there's also a function of new variants that may emerge as long as there's ongoing transmission around the world. And a lot of the work going on in the vaccine companies is about developing, new vaccines that will be more appropriate for new variants. So I think at this moment in time, the evidence is only slight that supports boosters for everyone. The government did make an announcement some months ago that would be an aspiration, but of course JCVI has yet to give its specific guidance on that. And so I still think that overwhelmingly vaccinees are protected from hospitalization, certainly from severity of disease requiring hospitalization, as Christina has just talked about. The last issue, and I'm sure other colleagues will want to come in, is with regard to equity. And I think that is there's a little bit of a false dichotomy there, because of course there should be vaccine use in one part of the world shouldn't be dependent on less use somewhere else. There should be patent waivers, there should be manufacturing capacity around the world so appropriate vaccines can be produced for governments to support their population.
Thank you very much, Dean. And I saw that Professor Anthony Costello, who's obviously got experience with the World Health Organization, is probably going to take up that international perspective. Anthony.
Thanks, Colin. It's a very good question. I mean, we've been asked previously about, should we forego childhood vaccination in order to send doses overseas? And actually, I think most of us were quite opposed to that, because for reasons that Christina's given, and the big surge in pediatric cases in unvaccinated populations in the United States right now suggests that we should certainly be vaccinating. The question of boosters is then more complex. One of the problems is that sending Pfizer, Moderna vaccines overseas, which require being stored at -80 and -20, requires a level of cold chain that many, many countries don't have. And the worry is that you could send a lot of vaccines overseas, and already this has been seen in many countries, or several countries, that they can't actually handle it and the vaccines go to waste. And also, I mean, this is to some extent a drop in the ocean. If we need 3 vaccines for everyone on the planet, or every person over, say, 12, we're going to need something like, 18 billion vaccine doses. That's 18,000 million. So far, COVAX has only been able to put out 160 million doses, which is way behind their schedule to get 20% of the world vaccinated by next summer. So their ambition is pretty low. We don't have any agreement on waiving patents. We are seeing very little in the way of technology transfer, although Joe Biden is arguing strongly for this and encouraging the companies. Moderna and Pfizer have both put the prices of their vaccines up by around 25 to 30% in the past month. The amount of funding going into finance is wholly inadequate. And so we don't have a collective global plan. And yet that's what we need. I would be happy to see donations being made from wealthy countries if it was also part of a much more ambitious collective global plan. But the booster issue is a tricky one.
Thank you very much, Anthony. And thank you for that question, Colin. And now we're going to move on to the next question, which comes from Felix Krish. Felix.
Hi, thanks very much. I want to know what the group's view is on whether they think that lateral flow tests are currently fit for purpose. Given that it appears they're going to be the first line of defence when schools reopen, and as Christina was saying earlier, given all the mitigations that were previously in place will have all been swept away. Looking at the details on the lateral flow test, you see that the MHRA seem to have given special authorization again for their use in this country, which I don't know whether it's due to be renewed or whether it's going to continue to be renewed. And the FDA in the US have not have gone the opposite way. And it seems to me that nobody seems to be talking about this. And I'm sure you all know, and I certainly know of anecdotal evidence where people are taking these tests or pretending to take the tests, the information that is then posted on a website or whatever. And there's so much, especially if you're doing the test yourself, there's so much potential for mistakes. And leaving aside the waste disposal issue of these millions of tests, which we won't go into. And finally, the point that you all make every week, week in, week out, which is the media seems to no longer be talking about, is localized test, trace, and supported isolation. Where is that in this next section of life that we're going into? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Felix. So 2 main questions there. What do we think about the utility of lateral flow device tests, and how are we going with supporting local find, test, trace, isolate? Who would like to start with that one? I'm looking around. I will pick on someone, but Professor Gabriel Scally has volunteered. Gabriel.
Yeah, well, I'll try, Felix, and touch on a couple of those issues, and the others can come in. You said, are they fit for purpose? Well, that's the question. What is the purpose? And as far as I'm concerned, they have an extraordinary limited purposes, in my view. I think they are useful as a routine check, for example, in an occupational setting. And one of the big problems we've had is food processing plants. And a stable workforce going in and out every day, picking up cases. So you're not making a decision at the door to say someone's all right to do something different from their normal routine. So it's not like using it for someone to go into a pub or a restaurant, or you're not giving them permission to do anything they wouldn't be doing routine. So they can pick up some cases there, but we know that if you're trying to use it as a guarantee that people are going to be COVID free, it's not going to work. So fit for purpose, I think the purpose needs to be well defined. And you talked about their use in schools, and the mitigations dropped off, and that's the whole point. You know, we need a strategy that a prevent and vaccinate strategy. Those are the two elements. There must be prevention there, and prevention doesn't consist of lateral flow tests. Prevention in school consists of getting more space. And a year ago, Independent Sage was talking about schools using the summer to expand their premises, to take on unused community premises, to put up marquees, to move stuff outdoors into suitable accommodation so that people could be spaced out and be better ventilated. We've been calling for better ventilation for classrooms, and I regularly remind people about New York City, where you can go online and see every classroom in every public school, and you can see what the ventilation report on that classroom is. And also, it's well worth considering our portable filtration, HEPA filters for classrooms as well. And there's a huge, and upgrading our mask wearing as well, not just wearing them, but we did start off with cloth face coverings, and they were really based upon the premise at the beginning of two things, really. The premise at the beginning that it was droplet spread, and secondly, there weren't properly made masks available for the public because they were all needed for healthcare, for the healthcare setting. So that we know it's airborne. We know that masks are effective, and we now know that the Delta variant, is much more infectious. So the response is entirely inappropriate. It couldn't be more inappropriate. And Christina's fantastic data presentation just shows the problem in the raw. Here we are, a year on, having been in a worse situation in very many respects than we were this time 12 months ago. And the government is doing nothing that looks to us as, with any degree of certainty, bringing this under control. In fact, as we know, their strategy at the moment is that they would like more people infected. They like more people to become ill now, go to hospital now and die now, rather than die in the autumn. It's amazing, but that is their strategy.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. And Dr. Zubaida Haque.
Thank you for that question, Felix. I'm just going to apply your question to schools. And I think there's two broad issues here, some of which, as Gabriel has touched on, in relation to schools. One is that MHRA they didn't give approval straight away in relation to mass testing with schools. So if you recall, back in December, January, the government wanted to roll out mass testing, and one of the main reasons they had to stop was because it was never approved. Mass testing with lateral flow tests was never approved to be used in that kind of way, where it was viewed as a green light test. And that, of course, is one of the biggest issues, because I think the sensitivity of these tests is only around 76, 75%. So around a quarter of the tests give you false negatives. And that is a huge problem when you've got no other mitigations in schools. But secondly, it's also a huge problem when you abandon contact tracing, when you abandon isolation for close contacts, as this government is intending to do, and as this government is intending to do in schools. So what is the point, really? What is the point of testing if you're going to say that isolation of close contacts doesn't matter? You're not going to support isolation. There doesn't seem to be any point. So we are in an extremely strange situation right now where, as you say, lateral flow test is not fit for purpose. It's viewed as a green light test when it shouldn't be, given the high rates of false negatives. And also, really, what is the point when you abandon isolation of close contacts?
Thank you, Zubaida. And Professor Stephen Reischer, you'd like to comment here?
So the first point is that it's not that lateral flow tests are the first line of defense. As has been pointed out, they're virtually the only line of defense. And it is remarkable how all the very simple and practical things that could have been done haven't been done. I was looking last night at our reports on schools. We put out one in November, and we put out one in January, and we put out one in February. And we made a number of very simple and practical suggestions, including improving ventilation and so on, and none of those have happened. None of them have happened. At the time, people say, oh, we haven't got the time to do it. 6 months later, because they haven't taken the time to do it, they again say, oh, well, it's too late to do it. It's only too late because of the level of quite culpable inertia that's happened. I'd also incidentally make the point that we contacted Ofqual and the Department for Education earlier this year about the examination system. And we said to them, unless you have robust systems to make sure there is fairness on the basis of gender and race and class within and between schools, you'll get massive inequalities. Again, they ignored that, with the consequence that the private schools now have pass rates which are more discrepant from those in public in state schools than they've ever been in the past. So all these things should have been done. Going on to lateral flow tests, well, there are two issues. There is the technical issue, and that's not my area of expertise, but there's also a very simple behavioral issue, and that is my area of expertise. And the very simple point is that if people cannot afford to test positive, then a self-administered lateral flow test is a complete and utter waste of time, because you're not going to take the risk of finding you are positive and having to self-isolate when you can't afford to self-isolate. And when the government increasingly say, well, it's up to you. In terms of if you're pinged as a contact, it's up to you whether to get a test or whether to self-isolate. What they're basically saying is we're not going to support you to self-isolate, which means people can't afford to self-isolate. And therefore, rather than giving choice to people, they're taking that choice away. And this goes back to another point, and probably it's one of the first points we ever made. We probably made it 18 months ago, but it's more relevant today than it ever was, that testing in general and lateral flow tests in particular are a complete waste of time unless you support people so that they genuinely have got the choice to self-isolate. And it seems to me that's a key point that we have to bear in mind in the discussion. It's not just technical, it's about whether people can afford to test positive. And nowadays, with the lack of support from the government, many people can't.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I mean, that is such an important point, isn't it? That very often it seems that the rhetoric around things like lateral flow device testing is that that is it, they're the end, but they're the means to the end. And if you're not going to be isolating an infected person from close contacts once they've tested positive, what is the point in doing the test? So thank you very much for that question, Felix. And moving on now to Katie Proctor from Politics Home, the website. Katie, what's your question?
Hi, Kate from Politics Home. I do think some of you might have sort of answered some of this already, but really it was to get people's perspectives on what the rates might be for cases among school-aged children. Sort of going into September, will we see a big spike? Will it lead to more hospitalizations? Some people have already had a go answering this in the chat bar, but would be happy to hear from anybody else.
Thank you very much, Kate. So a little bit of crystal ball gazing here, but armed with facts and figures, that it should be at least possible. Who would like to have a go at this? I'm imagining that Christina might want to pick this up. Christina.
Yeah, so I did answer in the chat, but obviously people watching can't see that. So every time children have gone to school in the context of high transmission rates, cases in kids have gone up. And so I can't see why this is going to be any different. So yes, I think cases will go up in September. You know, how quickly and where it will peak, I don't know. But generally, in previous school terms, they've kept going up until half term and then holidays. So there's no particular reason to think that will change in the near future. And yeah, when you have more cases, you'll end up with more hospitalizations. And again, like hospitalizations in kids are much lower than they are in adults, but they do happen. And we've already had 2,000 since May. So we could easily have that again next term. So I guess that's what I would say to that.
And we
Thank
haven't
you very
got
much,
to
Christina. And sorry,
I was just going to say,
were you coming back in there, Kate?
Yeah, we haven't got to a place where children have mainly had it. I mean, so many people, or I guess, you know, are we expecting children to get it again if they've already
the latest ONS antibody survey only went down to 16 years old, but at 16 years old, they were 37%, I think, of 16-year-olds had antibodies. Now, antibodies do underestimate the number of people who've had it, but we're certainly not where most kids have had it. No, we've still got, unfortunately, plenty of kids left who are still susceptible.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for that question, Kate, and for your answer there, Christina. And moving on now to a question from Diana Renton. Diana, are you with us?
I am. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Hello. So can you please advise whether it would be safer for me now to conceive, as I'm recently double jabbed, or wait until spring next year with the possibility maybe of a vaccination evading variant to emerge? And because I work in a secondary school, and so does my husband, I feel more at risk now, even though I am double jabbed with, as Christina has said, every mitigation has now disappeared and we have no social distancing. So I'm just trying to get my head around when is the safest time for me to conceive, because my husband and I are having IVF, so we can plan it much more neatly than otherwise. So any advice much appreciated.
Thank you very much, Diana. So this is really a question about, I suppose, contracting COVID during pregnancy and when is it most risky to do that. Dean, I saw that you had your hand up.
I mean, the first thing, Diana, is none of us are in a position to provide, you know, clinical advice to anyone. And clearly these are decisions that you need to take with other, you know, your own doctors and those looking after you, and you're going through IVF. I'd preface the answer with that. Clearly, you know, it's good that you've been immunized against COVID. We as Indy Sage, as you've heard, you know, are pushing that we want to get infections down as much as possible. But on the other hand, of course, vaccination is having an immensely positive impact on hospitalizations amongst those who have been double jabbed. So that's as far as I would go, but I would really encourage you for individual advice rather than coming to this group who clearly are not aware of your own personal circumstances, but to discuss it at length with your obstetricians and others, GPs and so forth, who are advising you.
Thank you very much, Dean, and extremely wise. I wonder if we could perhaps broaden this out and make it slightly more generic and talk about COVID in pregnancy more generally. What do we know about COVID and pregnancy at this point? I wondered if Anthony Costello might have a perspective on that. But Dean, do you want to come back on that?
Well, I'd only say that there is some evidence that amongst unvaccinated pregnant women, you know, late on in pregnancy, in third trimester, there is an increased, looks to be an increased risk of more severe disease for whatever reason. There are many reasons why that may be, and of course, you know, one of the astounding pieces of information coming out about younger people, these not adolescents, but younger people in their 20s or 30s, there seemed a much larger proportion of those women who are pregnant who are unvaccinated than their non-pregnant counterparts. It's something that many hospitals are seeing, many maternity units are seeing, and that is of concern. And so we, in fact, the Royal College of Obstetrics and Gynecology recommendations at the moment is that vaccination, being pregnant is not a contraindication, is not a reason not to be vaccinated. The benefits of being vaccinated far outweigh the risks, and certainly unvaccinated women are at more risk of infection. So that's what I would say in terms of encouragement of vaccination in this group of individuals, and of course, a large number of women of childbearing age wishing to become pregnant, and I think there just needs to be a strong push for immunisation. Thanks.
Thank you, Dean. And Anthony, would you like to comment?
Well, no, Dean's largely covered it. Just to say that the Royal College of Obstetrics advise all women to be vaccinated after 14 weeks of gestation, so not in the first 3 months or so. And yeah, I mean, there is an increased relative risk of pregnant women late in pregnancy getting more serious disease or more going into intensive care units, but the risk is very low. I mean, the vast majority of people, and in fact, the evidence of affecting newborns is extremely low risk. So I think, one could approach when you're pregnant of being very optimistic, but get vaccinated, ideally before you get pregnant, and then things should go fine.
Thank you very much, Dean and Anthony. And Diana, thank you for that question. And I hope you understand that we obviously can't give individual clinical advice, and that's why you've been referred back to your consultants. But hopefully some of that broader context is useful as well. So thank you for that question. Moving on now to Kirsty Stanley. Thank you. Kirsty, are you there with us and ready to ask your question?
Hi there, yes I am. So I'm an independent occupational therapist and also a member of the Long COVID Support Employment Group. And my question actually links to last week's topic, but perhaps conversely looks at the positive mental health effects of the pandemic. And conversely, the fact that now the negative risks to some people's mental health is increasing now we're opening up. So particularly with regards to people with neurodivergence and chronic illness who have found educational work and social opportunities finally opened up to them. For example, the only reason I'm able to work is because I've been doing so flexibly from home, but these opportunities are being backtracked. So my question is, how do we maintain the positive momentum that the pandemic has created in the lives of these populations, keep a hybrid approach and dismantle the ableism that is even more apparent in our society now? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that great question, Kirsty. And I see that in your written question that you sent us before, you did express something about reasonable adjustments, which I think that's just so important to realise that there were ways that we could have been dealing with things before that we didn't, and reasonable adjustments have been made. And now there's a bit of frustration that those reasonable adjustments might be rolled back, and that really is a bit of ableism there. So what can we do about this? Can we keep some of these different ways of working in place? Should we be expecting a completely new normal? Professor Martin McKee and then Zubaida.
Yeah, thanks very much. This is something we've been thinking quite a bit. I'm on a pan-European commission looking at health after the pandemic, and there have been so many changes in the way that we work and just the way we think about work and where people can work from and so on. And there is a very extensive debate at the minute about whether people will come back to offices and showing that people can actually be very productive. Now, the whole point, as you know very well, is that there is a statutory duty to make reasonable adjustments for people anyway. And I think what this has done is that it has opened up the scope of what we mean by reasonable adjustments. There are lots of adjustments that might have been dismissed as impossible or impractical or whatever before. So I think we do need to sort of reset our vision of what work means. The difficulty we're facing, of course, is that there are very, very powerful vested interests in doing things the way we have done them, not least people who have invested in property. And we've got to be realistic. There are many small coffee shops and things like that that have grown up which actually serve commuters and so on and so forth. So that's going to be an issue as we sort of try to look at what this new normal will be like. Now, we've written a bit about this elsewhere, but I think that the point that you're making is that things are going to be different. They're going to be different in all sorts of ways in terms of how we think about things. And that was what happened in 1918, after the pandemic in 1918 as well. Things were very different. And there is quite a bit of discussion going on about what this will mean, but I'm not quite sure that anybody's quite there as to where we will be. And there will be unpredictable issues that come up anyway. So I'm just reinforcing what you're saying, but probably not giving any particularly good advice there.
Thank you very much, Martin. Zubaida, you wanted to comment, and then Professor Susan Mickey, I'll come to you. Zubaida.
Kirsty, that is such an important point, because I think if there's one thing we've learned through this pandemic is we certainly don't want to go back to the old normal, post-pandemic or post-COVID recovery. And that's because the old normal didn't work for a lot of groups. It didn't work for women in particular. It didn't work for people who had disability issues, and actually didn't work for a lot of young people either. And what we've seen in this pandemic is that the pandemic has disproportionately hit women in terms of employment, in terms of their labour market prospects, in terms of losing jobs, losing wages, being furloughed. And it's also hit young people and disabled people particularly hard in very many of the same ways. Now, I'm conscious that you were talking about the positive impact, for instance, being able to work flexibly from home because of Zoom. And you're absolutely right. I think for a lot of women out there, for a lot of disabled people out there, being able to work in this way is fantastic, because it means that they can work flexibly, they can work from home, and so on. But I'm also conscious at the same time, what we know from labour market research is when you do work more from home, when you do work flexibly, the flip side of it is also you're less likely to be promoted, because the way you get promoted, the way you get reward at work is much more to do with being at work, being face to face. And of course, men benefit from that, able people benefit that from so on. So I think what we need, Kirsty, is a new way, a different way where we look at equality considerations, where the government look at their public sector equality duties and look at it in those ways in terms of bringing back a better post-COVID recovery for the labour market, and for a labour market that works for everybody, not just for some.
Thank you, Zubaida. Professor Susan Mickey.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And just to add to what the others have said, I think it needs to be thought about at a citywide, regional, national level. The whole way we live and work didn't make sense for so many people previously. There's mention, I think Martin mentioned it, about the coffee shops in the middle of cities that are closing down. For every coffee shop in the middle of a city centre that's closing down, there are tens, if not hundreds, of closed retail, pubs, coffee shops that are shut down across Britain. There are big economic wastelands because everything was concentrated in the middle of big cities, with people having to commute often 1 to 2 hours each way a day at vast expense, pouring carbon dioxide out into the planet, just doesn't make sense. So there's many different things that don't make sense. We look around ourselves, we've got overcrowded housing, we've got homelessness at the same time as we've got huge number of properties that are just investment properties, often from people who don't even live in the country. There's a lot of irrationalities that have to some extent been there for a long time, but this has really shone a spotlight on it. And I think the majority of people do not want to go back to how things have been before. But then the question is, you raised it, how do we hang on to, the small positive changes that have been, but how do we add to that with a vision of how things could and should be? And, as ever, you look back through history, how has anything ever changed? It's really changed by people getting together and making their voices heard, whether it's in communities, whether it's in workplaces, in educational institutions or whatever. And I remember when I was young, my early 20s, we had a London council, we had regional planning all over the country, which was really democratic, which people were involved in. And you could be involved in being part of thinking about how should cities be, how should employment be? There were whole regeneration schemes that local communities could be part of. That whole way of organising society and having a vision for how things could be better has been lost. I think it's up to all of us, just in our own ways, to try and bring that back again.
Thank you very much for that, Susan. And Professor Stephen Reiter, you want to have a word here as well. How can we hang on to the positives, do you think?
Well, I mean, like everyone else, I think this is an absolutely key question. And I wanted to address it more in the short term of what we do immediately. Because I think there are two very different visions of how we reopen and what freedom means. One, which is the one that has been promoted very much, I think, by the government, is a sort of I'm all right, Jack approach of I go out and I do what I want and I have my freedoms as to whether I wear a mask or not, or whether I distance or not. And I don't think about the consequences for others. And I don't think about what that means for how safe they are. It's very much, I think, an exclusive notion in which the strong and the fit and the healthy can do what they like and devil take the hindmost. And another approach is to think about things in terms of a community level and inclusive reopening, which means us acting in ways that not only give us freedom, but which make others feel free, which don't make others feel scared, which don't lead us to act in ways that lead others to think, well, it's unsafe for me to go out into the public domain. We've had all this talk about personal responsibility. I think it's crucial to think about social responsibility and, to say, acting in ways that make that reopening inclusive. And that's what's got us through the pandemic so far. All the evidence shows that one of the key factors in people acting in ways that protect themselves and protect others has to do with being concerned with the community and the good of the community. But that's not only true at an individual level, it has to be true at, if you like, an institutional level as well. We need businesses, for instance, to make clear that they have protection so that everybody can go into those restaurants and feel safe. Everyone can go into those bars. Everybody can go to those cinemas. That's good for business, but it's also good for social inclusion, creating spaces which everyone can go to. So it does seem to me it's absolutely critical, as I say, on an individual and a systemic level, to make sure that the reopening of society is an inclusive reopening and not an exclusive reopening in which the strong do what they like and everybody else suffers. And I think that needs a change of perspective in messaging, and I think it needs changes at a systemic level as well.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Kirsty, thank you very much for that question. And wouldn't it be amazing if some positive things emerge out of this pandemic? I'm going to squeeze in another couple of questions. I reckon we've got time for another couple of questions. They might have to be short, so please keep your questions short, and the answers might have to be really concise as well. Janice Plant, first of all. Janice.
Hello, can you hear me?
We certainly can. Go ahead.
Okay. So with all the mixed messaging there's been throughout the pandemic, do you think the general public are being armed with the right messaging as to how they can keep themselves safe as we move indoors for the autumn, winter? I'm thinking of ventilation. I'm sure, oh, okay, sorry, start your video. I'm sure my friends think I'm crazy when I keep banging on about us meeting outdoors. And it seems to me that a lot of people, I mean, a really lot of people still think they're safe inside buildings with the windows shut, as long as they stay a metre plus away from the other people. So I doubt they're considering aerosols. And the other thing I was saying, the other day, Trish Greenhow, if that's how you say it, tweeted a link to some animated films which included aerosol transmission. Is there any way this kind of messaging could reach a much wider audience? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Janice. And yeah, Trish Greenhow of Oxford University is somebody great to follow on Twitter for our viewers if you don't already, and has worked with fantastic artists to create those infographic films. They're really good. So yes, are the general public armed with enough information to protect themselves as this is the way things are headed as we move into the autumn and winter? I mean, that seems like one for you again, Stephen, or perhaps Susan. I could start with you.
Yes, I'm happy to begin that. Well, if you look at survey data, quite a lot of people still say they don't feel confident that they know enough to be able to protect themselves and protect other people. And that does seem quite extraordinary after so long of having been able to get the messages across. I think there's two problems. One is what the messages are, and the other is how the messages are communicated. And it's not enough just to have a one-off communication campaign. One's got to sort out what are the key messages. They need to be got over again and again in different modalities, going to where people are, using the terminology and the language of different groups so that everybody gets it. And that's just not done, especially, as you say, with these key issues about ventilation. It's extraordinary the number of people who still don't understand that. And that's not for want of being able to understand it if the information is given. The information just isn't given in the ways that really gets through to people. Now, one thing that many of us who've been involved in this work over the last, whatever it's been, 16 months, have been saying to government is the importance of working with communities to develop communication strategies, not having people wherever they might be, in Public Health England, in the Cabinet Office Communications group or whatever, to come up, from their own head or from what they know with communication strategies. It's about what we call co-creation or co-development, getting together with the people who the communication is aimed at and together generating strategies. And it's not just about giving messages, it's about ensuring that these messages are embedded in all parts of people's everyday lives. So there's huge room for improvement. What can I say? And we've been saying this for a long time, but we'll keep on saying it.
Thank you very much, Susan. Gabriel, you wanted a quick word.
I did. Ventilation is one of my topics I get very enthusiastic about. I just happened to be reading a great book from 1892 by Arthur Newshome, who went on to be Chief Medical Officer of England. And a great Chief Medical Officer was, of course, that was the days when public health doctors were the Chief Medical Officers, not clinicians. And this is a public health issue. And let me just, his chapter, which I have to bookmark, Methods of Ventilation, he opens by saying, in most houses, no means of ventilation are provided, the supply of fresh air being left to circumstances or never thought of. And that's still true now. And he goes into enormous detail about how we should be incorporating air flushing into houses, how we should be relying not just on windows, but how the windows are opened, how much they opened, and what sort of flow you want. And one of the things, difficult things, talking to people about ventilation is that they say, but there'll be drafts, and no, there don't have to be drafts. It's about changing the air within a room on a regular basis so that the virus doesn't build up. And they knew that because they were trying to prevent tuberculosis and other airborne diseases, and they got it right. And we've forgotten all of that. So we have to relearn a lot of that stuff. And that means everyone learning, not just us being told what to do by the government, but it means the government doing things to help it happen by changing the building regulations, by producing guides for businesses, for retail spaces, for leisure spaces, about how we can get to the situation where we do have airflow and people have a legal right actually in workplaces to an adequate supply of fresh or purified air. And what COVID-19 has done, it's changed very much the definition of what fresh and purified air means. And the government needs to recognize that there needs to be a huge program to deal with issues like ventilation, not just a few glossy ads. Glossy ads are great, and they do reinforce things, but it's got to be a comprehensive program. And thank you for asking the question. It's great.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. Oh, Stephen, you wanted a quick word, and then we'll squeeze in one last question. Stephen.
Okay. Well, I mean, in many ways, I think the key point is that, number one, is the messaging adequate? No, it's completely inadequate. I mean, even take the most basic thing of all, which is knowing your symptoms so you know when to get and test and when to isolate. The symptoms on the NHS website are still the symptoms of previous variants, and they don't apply to the Delta variant. So basic messaging is a problem. And the second thing, and it's the point that Gabriel made, is it's all very well to give information, but information is useless unless there are the resources to help you to act. So again, yes, we need to know to open the windows, but that's little good if the windows don't open, whether it's at home or in domestic spaces. It's little good knowing that we have to self-isolate if we can't afford to self-isolate. So we need the information so we can act responsibly, but we need the government to take its responsibility seriously and provide the resources and make sure our environments are safe so we can keep ourselves safe in those environments.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you for that question, Janice. And a final question then from Gary Hatt. Gary, who is still with us. Hello, Gary. What's your question?
I am still with you. Yes, thank you very much, Alice. My question is, do the panel feel that the booster jab should be given to vulnerable people in September or October? Because WHO have suggested it should be October because of other nations catching up with vaccination.
Thank you very much. So yeah, we covered a little bit about booster jabs earlier, but who would like to take that up? And I wonder if I could roll in a question of my own. I know it's late in the day, but Christina, you showed that hospitalizations as a percentage of cases were increasing again. And I wondered, you suggested a demographic solution to that or explanation for that. And I wondered if you thought perhaps there could be a likelihood that this is also waning immunity that we're seeing, or do we not think that's happening? So if we could deal with my question and Gary's at the same time, that would be fantastic. Christina.
Just on your question on waning immunity, I don't think so, because we're still seeing far fewer in the over 85s who were vaccinated first. I think the waning immunity evidence seems to be coming mostly from Israel and a little bit from the US. The UK is quite different in that we had the longer interval. We had 10 to 12 weeks instead of 3 weeks, which means firstly that we had the second dose more recently, which will mean that if we do wane, we'll wane a bit later. And also we had the longer interval, and there is some suggestion that a longer interval actually gives you better protection. So it seems as if that decision that we made in January was a really good one if we're worried about waning. So I don't think we're seeing that yet, although it is something we have to look out for in September and October.
Thank you very much, Christina. And so then leading into Gary's question, which was a bit more specific, and we don't know whether those booster vaccinations are definitely going to be offered at this point. But if they are, when would be a sensible time to do them? Who would like to tackle that? Anybody? Deenan.
I mean, thanks, Gary, for the question. We don't know. Interestingly, there was a trial of 3 doses in immunocompromised patients. These are transplant recipients receiving treatment to dampen their immune system. That's just been published now, but that was on a schedule of, I think, month 0, month 1, and month 3. So a very different sort of scenario to what we're talking about boosters. And I think, as Christina alluded to, all eyes really are on Israel at the moment, because they had a much more rapid initiation and coverage of 2-dose vaccines at an earlier stage. And so, everyone's looking and seeing what's happening there. There has been some data recently from Israel demonstrating, yes, that there is there does become an increased rate of new infections in those who've vaccinated, the longer time has lapsed. But I think none of those infections were severe enough to require hospitalization. Doesn't mean that they weren't, they were trivial, but nevertheless, those were the data. And I think there's still a lot unknown, to be perfectly honest. And it'll be, I think, premature for certainly me to offer that direct answer to you whether September or October is the best time. We obviously, JC, the Joint Committee of Vaccination and Immunisation, is looking at all the data, and they have access to unpublished data as well. And so we await to see what they advise.
Thank you very much, Dean, and thank you very much for that question, Gary. I am going to have to draw it to a close now. We could carry on all afternoon, but we won't. I'm going to hand over to our founder chair, Sir David King, to summarise. Sir David.
Thank you very much, Alice. Well, all I want to say is, first of all, so a few things about the quality of expertise in the group that have been meeting the public every week for more than the last year. First of all, in terms of public health expertise, this group is extremely well represented by global experts. And if I was to be asked, if you had to set up a team to manage this, would you go only for one area? And if so, which would you choose? If I was told I could only have one area, I would go for public health. This is absolutely vital. We know that when it comes to handling a pandemic, these are the people who understand all of the necessities. But of course, the second thing is this group goes way beyond public health. We do have a full range of experts. And the third thing I want to say is the importance of openness, honesty, and transparency. The idea was that this group would demonstrate to government how you can get the trust of the public, and of course we were hoping at the same time to get the trust of the government. I do not think that government advice from the highest levels can be given without engaging fully with the government at the same time as with the public. And here we are having yet another session engaging fully with the public. Now, I do want to just comment, and it sounds like I'm picking one person out, but Christina Pagel has really dominated the themes by giving us a wonderful account every week of the state of the pandemic. So I just want to pick Christina out as somebody who has served the public and hopefully the government so very well. This time, I was just enormously impressed with her comparison. 100 per day a year ago was the number of deaths, and 700 cases per day are now 23,000 cases per day. But what is important is hospital admissions are 10 times higher than a year ago. Now, to me, that figure is absolutely critical, because we all know the pressures that our hospitals are under and their staff, trying to deliver a normal service, which is already quite under enormous pressure, and on top of this, dealing with this pandemic. I want to finally make an international comparison. We all know the stories of Australia and New Zealand, and every now and again our papers will parade forward that Australia now has cases, etc. But let's just take a challenged look at the number of cases in those countries we're comparing with. China, for example, we see headlines that the pandemic has arrived back in China where it began. I've been looking into this, and I believe the total number of cases over the last month in China has been 1,000. Compare that with where we are talking about today, around 23,000 new cases a day. So what am I raising that for? The real way to handle an epidemic of this kind is to move rapidly and separate those people who have the symptoms, have the disease, from the rest of the public. The rest of the public can then get on with their normal business. We never managed to achieve that, and the result is where we stand today. So I congratulate my friends and colleagues on this group, absolutely wonderful group. I would challenge anyone to put together a better group for advice on an issue like this. And with that, I say thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Sir David King. And on this day when you've handed over the reins of chairing the group to Professor Dean Pillay, thank you very much for being the founder chair of Independent Sage. Thank you to all the scientists as well, all of whom are here as volunteers, and they're here because they believe that as a society we need open communication between scientists and the public, especially now, especially during a pandemic when we're all making important decisions, and we need to be armed with information, we need to be able to ask questions, and we also need to be listened to. They came together as this group because they believed in that vision so eloquently expressed by Sir David King, that importance of openness, honesty and transparency, and engaging fully with the public. All of the Independent Sage reports are available on the website, along with biographies of everybody you see here and the whole team of Independent Sage. And you can follow Independent Sage on Twitter and Instagram too. Thank you to everybody watching, whether you're watching us live or catching up. Thank you for your questions too. Please do keep those coming in. We'll be back same time, same place next Friday. In the meantime, stay safe and keep well.